What I wanted to do today, as we've mentioned the last couple of weeks, is that this class of tefillah is an opportunity at times of the year to focus on parts of the year and aspects of tefillah specifically connected to the time of year. So last week we talked a little bit about David Hashem Ori, the tefillah that we say during Elul. And what I wanted to do today was talk about Selichot, to talk about the tefillah of Selichot. As many of us know, Selichot is the tefillah that is specific to, or mostly associated with, the time of the year before, leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Those of us who are Sephardim have begun to say Selichot already on Rosh Chodesh Elul. Ashkenazim will be beginning Selichot on Motzei Shabbat and continuing them through Yom Kippur. Selichot are also said, it should be noted, are not just said during this time of the year, they're also said on fast days throughout the year. But that's often because, again, the fast days take on a certain type of theme that is really connected to what we're talking about now, which is the theme of tshuva that is unique to this time of the year. So what I wanted to do today was just to try to understand and do a little bit of a deep dive into Selichot themselves. The first thing I want to do is try to understand where the minhag came from, the idea of saying Selichot during all of Elul. Where did the Sephardic minhag come from to start in Rosh Chodesh Elul? Where did the minhag develop that we start on the Motzei Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, unless Rosh Hashanah is less than 4 days before, less than 4 days after Motzei Shabbat, and then we start the week before? Where does all of that come from? To understand the minhag of Selichot and perhaps some meaning behind that minhag. And then I hope as well, B'ezrat Hashem, depending on how much time we have, is to highlight a number of themes that come up in the Selichot, understanding a little bit of the structure of the Selichot, and then developing a couple of themes that we find in the Selichot. So B'ezrat Hashem, and I apologize, I'm still a little bit under the weather, but definitely better than last week, so I hope you can hear me a little bit better. Okay, so in order to understand the history or understand where the minhag developed, we have to we'll start with the Rambam. Now the Rambam quotes here in sources 1 and 2, he's one of many Rishonim who quote that the truth is that the minhag to say Selichot, the initial minhag to say Selichot was to begin saying Selichot on Rosh Hashanah. And from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, that was initially the time when Selichot were generally said, which makes a lot of sense. That's a specific time period. That's right, you made tshuva. As you see here in source number 1, the Rambam, this is a well-known Rambam. Source number 1, Afal pi shehat tshuva vehatze'aka yafeh le'olam. Even though tefillah and shouting to Hashem are things that are always appropriate, be'aseret hayamim shebein Rosh Hashanah v'Yom HaKippurim hi yafeh biyoter. The time period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there is a special concept of tefillah and what he calls tze'aka, shouting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Umitkabelet hi miyad, and it will be much more accepted, shene'emar, as the pasuk says, dirshu Hashem behi matzeo, that you should search out for Hashem when he can be found. And as we've mentioned, that's, according to Chazal, that's a reference to a certain time period where you should search at Hashem at a time when he is closer, which, as we mentioned last week, is generally considered to be a time of Elul, or specifically a time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And therefore, at least the Rambam is hinting to, the uniqueness of the time period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Rambam, in the next parak, in source number 2, elaborates upon this idea of the unique opportunity between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And again, some of this is a well-known Rambam you may be familiar with. Says the Rambam, Afal pi shetkiyat shofar b'Rosh Hashanah gzerat hakatuv. Even though the idea of blowing shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a gzerat hakatuv, meaning we don't necessarily know the reason, it is a decree by the Torah. Remez yeshbo. There is a hint that we can try to understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have us blow the shofar. What could be that hint? Kilomar, uru yeshenim mishinaschem v'nir damim hakitzu mitar damatchem v'chipsu b'maasechem v'chizru b'tshuva v'zichru barachem. The idea, perhaps, says the Rambam, one of the main ideas of the Tkiyat Shofar is that it's like an alarm clock. It's like that alarm clock where we're deep in slumber. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, boom, you hear that alarm clock go off, and you're looking and you're like, I can't believe it's morning already. Okay, right? So the same thing is here. We're sleeping. We are proverbially sleeping. And the shofar comes to tell us, wake up, everybody, wake up from your slumber, recognize that you've been living life as if you're in a daze, and wake up from your sleep and do tshuva. So says the Rambam, that's one of the main ideas behind the shofar, is that it is meant to jolt us a little bit, like that alarm clock, to wake up from just the regular day to day. Continues the Rambam, Elu hasholchim et ha'emet. These are the people who forget about the reality. Behavlei zman, that they waste their time. V'shogim kol shnatam behevel varik, and they spend all of their years dealing or working on things that are not as meaningful. I apologize. Those who are coming in, the source sheets are at the edge there, so I'm sorry. Maybe we should just have her, if you can bring them out, and she can just have them so that when people come in, she can give them it's probably best for her to just give them at the desk there, so that way people don't come in and they're over here. Sorry, these are the sheets. If you don't mind just bringing the rest to her so that she can, thank you. That way I don't have to keep stopping. The shofar tells us, look at yourselves, look at your souls. Habitu darchechem u'malelechem. Look at where you're going. V'yazov kol echad mikem darko hara'a u'machshavto asher letova. And you should leave your bad path, and you should move away from anything that is not considered good. Again, I'm reading this, even though this is not as relevant for this, we'll see why it's relevant for the Selichot, but I think it's also a powerful reminder for all of us. Continues the Rambam, Lefikach, therefore tzarich kol adam, sheyir'eh atzmo kol hashana kula ki'ilu chetzio zakai v'chetzio chayav. This is a very, very important line, a little bit of a scary line. Says the Rambam, every person should see himself as if he is in a situation where right now he has 50-50. 50% zchuyot, 50% merits, and 50% chiyuvim, 50% where he is guilty. And Avi wrote, v'chein kol ha'olam chetzio zakai v'chetzio chayav. Not only should you see yourself as that, but you should see your situation as if the entire world is hanging in the balance right now, where the entire world is 50-50, zchuyot versus averot. Okay? And chata chet echad harei hichriya et atzmo ve'et kol ha'olam kulo lekav chova v'garam lo hashchata. If you do one chet, this is how we should see ourselves. We should see it a personal responsibility that we have the ability to tip the scale for the entire world. And if we do one sin, we might tip that scale in a negative way. Asa mitzvah achat harei hichriya et atzmo ve'et kol ha'olam kulo lekav zchut v'garam lo v'lahem tshu'a v'hatzala. If you do one mitzvah instead of doing one avera, then you have the opportunity to tip the scale in a positive way. Says the Rambam, we each need to see ourselves as we approach the Yamim Noraim, as if every action we do impacts our own reality and also impacts the rest of the world, because we're all part of this entire world. Shene'emar v'tzadik yesod olam. What does that mean that tzaddik is the foundation of the world? Shetzadak hichriya et kol ha'olam l'zchut v'hitzilo. It means, what does it mean? He's the foundation of the world. That through his actions, he was able to tip the scales of the world into positive favor. And now this is the important part for us. We're 3 lines from the bottom, halfway in. Umipnei inyan zeh, because of the severity and the seriousness of these days of Aseret Yemei Tshuva, nahagu kol beit Yisrael leharbot b'tzdaka uv'maasim tovim v'la'asok b'mitzvot mirosh Hashanah v'ad Yom Kippurim yeter mikol Hashanah. The minhag is that we have a special focus from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. We have a special focus where we add more tzedakah, we try to do better deeds, we're involved in limud Torah and in mitzvot, because how serious of a time this is. Therefore, the minhag has become for us to continue to do more, to build more zchuyot. Continues the Rambam, v'nahagu kulam. And there's a minhag, lakum balayla, to get up in the middle of the night, ba'aseret yamim ha'elu, ulehitpalel b'vatei knesiot b'divrei tachanunim v'kibushim ad sheyaor hayom. And then there is a minhag as part of this theme of continuing to build our zechuyot for ourselves in the world. The minhag was that during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, people would get up in the middle of the night and they would say extra tefillot and tachanunim and daven all the way until sunrise. Okay, so this is really the initial concept of saying Selichot. And as we see from the Rambam, it really was meant to be between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because these are the most serious days, and that's where the Selichot began. However, as many of us are familiar, and as we move on to source number 3, by the time we get to the Shulchan Aruch, our halacha practically, we see that the minhag has expanded. The minhag of Selichot has expanded to not just between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but rather earlier, either from Rosh Chodesh Elul or from the Motzei Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah. Look in source number 3. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Nohagim lakum be'ashmoret Lomar slichot v'tachanunim mirosh chodesh Elul ve'elach ad Yom HaKippurim. We have the minhag, says the Shulchan Aruch, to get up very early in the morning. Ashmoret refers to the last, right before Netzach, right before sunrise, to say slichot v'tachanunim from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur. So that's the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch is obviously the source for the Sfaradim, who generally follow Shulchan Aruch. They get up from Rosh Chodesh Elul. Continues the Rama in the smaller print in source number 3. Umidhag b'nei Ashkenaz enokein. But those of us who are b'nei Ashkenaz, we don't start from Rosh Chodesh Elul. Ela mirosh Chodesh ve'elach matchilim litkoa acharat tfilat hashofar. We do begin by blowing the shofar. That minhag we do begin after Rosh Chodesh Elul. V'yesh mikomot shetokin gam kein ba'arvit, and some blow even in Arvit, although I've never seen that before. But we generally, our minhag is to blow shofar after shacharit, not at night. V'omdim be'ashmurot lomar slichot b'yom aleph shelifnei Rosh Hashanah. And we begin slichot not Rosh Chodesh Elul, but rather the Sunday or Motzei Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah. V'imchal Rosh Hashanah bet az matchilim b'yom aleph shavua shelifanav. And if Rosh Hashanah begins on Monday or Tuesday, which means we don't have the 4 days to say slichot before Rosh Hashanah, then we begin slichot a week before. Okay, so we have here, and this is the Ramah, and that's the source for the Ashkenazim. Now, there's a joke that is very commonly said. I imagine many of you have heard that the reason why the Sfardim have to say Slichot so much longer is because they need to get forgiveness for eating Kitniot on Pesach. I'll let us decide whether or not it's worth it. I'll let you all decide whether it's worth it to be able to eat Kitniot on Pesach and then have to get up in that. But either way, that is the minhag. Now, the question is, again, where did this come from? Where did it come from? What's the idea behind saying Slichot from Rosh Chodesh Elul, or the Ashkenazim starting right before? So look at the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah already begins to explain this. The first thing the Mishnah Berurah outlines is why the minhag is to do it at night. Why is the minhag specifically at night, whether it's either in the middle of the night by chatzot, or the minhag that many have is very, very early in the morning, meaning towards the end of the night? Why is that the time that we try to say Slichot? So the Mishnah Berurah in source number 4 begins by explaining that. He says, Desof halayla, why specifically the end of the night or the nighttime? HaKadosh Baruch Hu shat ba'olam hazeh v'hu eit ratzon. Okay, from a Kabbalistic level, it's understood. I think that's just an internal thing in the shul. I don't think that's it would be much louder if we had anything to worry about. Okay. Desof halayla HaKadosh Baruch Hu shat ba'olam hazeh v'hu eit ratzon. That the end of the night is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is shot, literally means, I think it means hovers in this world from a Kabbalistic perspective, and it's considered to be an 8 ratzon, a time, a very special time for us to be able to daven, and that's why generally either midnight or sometime from midnight until the morning, it's considered to be the best time to do slichot. And the truth is that back, as I understood it, the communities used to really do it only at midnight or very early in the morning. I think now, what we would call Yiridat HaDorot, we generally find it much harder to be able to do that. There are still many communities nowadays that will only daven slichot at chatzot or very early in the morning. And the idea being to push themselves and to use this time to really, even if it means you're going to be a little bit more tired, to push yourself. However, there are many people who just simply can't keep to that schedule. They're unable to, and therefore the minhag has become to daven even a little bit later in the morning, or some have the minhag to have it earlier in the evening. Every shul should follow whatever the Rav of their community decides. But it's definitely clear that the better time for those who are able to, which is why I think also many communities, specifically the first night of Motzei Shabbat, they try to do it, is chatzot, midnight, or very early in the morning is definitely the most ideal time for those who are able to do that, as long as it doesn't disrupt their main schedule. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Why Rosh Chodesh Elul? Why a whole month before? Uma shenahagu mirosh Chodesh Elul, says the Mishnah Berurah, she'az ala Moshe behar Sinai lakachat luchot achronot ve'eviru shofar b'machaneh. Moshe ala lahar shelo yitu od achar avodah zara v'havei eit ratzon. Okay, so says the Mishnah Berurah, a relatively common idea. I'm sorry. Exactly. I thought it was avodah zara. Thank you. You're right. The ayin zayin there is another meaning after another egel hazav. Okay, so says, thank you. So says the Mishnah Berurah, the reason is because of the history. When was the first Rosh Chodesh Elul? The first Rosh Chodesh Elul was the time when Moshe Rabbeinu, after Chet HaEgel, went back up to Har Sinai in order to achieve atonement. Okay, as many of us may be familiar, we had, the Torah was given on Vav Sivan, Vav Zayin Sivan. Okay, according to the tradition, on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of the Tammuz, was when Moshe came down with the Luchot and when Bnei Yisrael committed the Chet HaEgel. And therefore, there were 40 days from Shiva Asar B'Tammuz until Rosh Chodesh Elul, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was still, as we would call it, B'Ka'as, angry at Am Yisrael, there was no opportunity to achieve atonement. On Rosh Chodesh Elul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, come back up. And Moshe goes back up, and during these 40 days, from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur, are considered to be, or really the initial Eit Ratzon. This is the first time in a serious way the Jewish nation has sinned and is able to achieve a certain level of forgiveness. Now, it's important to know and to understand that during those 40 days, it wasn't clear were we going to attain forgiveness or not. Meaning these 40 days were 40, that from the perspective of Am Yisrael, there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of stress. Moshe's going up, he's saying, I'm going to try to achieve atonement. I'm going to do my best to speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on your behalf. And for 40 days, Am Yisrael, I guess, again, if I had to paint the picture, are a little bit as we would call bemetach. They're under stress, they're under pressure. Is Moshe going to be successful in achieving that atonement? And for those 40 days, Moshe davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as we know, on Yom Kippur, finally HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Salachti, I forgive them. And Moshe Rabbeinu comes down. And that's why Yom Kippur is known as the Yom Slicha v'Kapara. That's why Yom Kippur is our day of atonement, our day of forgiveness, because the first time that was achieved after Chet HaEgel. And in order to commemorate this 40-day period, says the Mishnah Berurah, and this is what many of the Mefarshim say, that's why many people have the minhag to start from Rosh Chodesh Elul, because these 40 days commemorate that time when Moshe achieved forgiveness. If we want to take it a step further, I think we can even add that the number 40 in the world of Chazal and in the world of Halacha is also very significant and very often signifies a sense of rebirth or recreation. Where do we know the number 40 in Halacha? A baby, exactly. A baby is considered halachically to be considered a creation, or they're considered to be halachically valid after day 40. Where else do we see day? Where else do we see 40? Malkut. Excellent. I never thought about that one. That's an interesting one. Although it's 39, it's not 40, but where else?
It's supposed to be 40.
It's 40, but we do 39. Where else do we see 40 in Jewish history? 40 days of what? 40 days of Sphira, excellent. Well, 49 days of Sphira, but 40 days of what? Rain. Good. When? Exactly, Noach. When God recreated the world, it rained for 40 days. Okay? Very good.
Any connection to 40 days, 40 nights up on the Har Sinai, Moshe?
I'm sorry? Again, the same idea. The 40 days of Moshe going up to Har Sinai was again to recreate our relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so the concept of 40 in the world of Halacha and in the world of Chazal is a concept of recreation. And therefore, I think, patterned after that is this idea of saying Selichot for 40 days. The idea of saying Selichot for 40 days on an individual level is representing a recreation on an individual level of the person and trying to, again, achieve that level of excuse me. Just one more that I just forgot to mention. Another one with 40 is a mikvah. Okay, 40 sa'ah is the amount of water, is the amount of water you need to create a mikvah. And a mikvah, of course, is also a symbol of recreation, is also a symbol of renewal. So all of these are within the same theme of tshuva being a process of renewal, and 40 days making a lot of sense. And that's the source for 40 days before. Just the Mishnah Berurah even adds on. It's just interesting to see. We did a little bit of some play on words last week as well. If we continue in the Mishnah Berurah, the source we were just reading, the second line, the last word, V'ika asmachta. There's even a hint to this. Mikra ani lidodi v'dodidli. As many of us know, that the phrase ani v'dodi v'dodidli, Rashi tevot. The first letter of each one spells out what? Elul. Excellent. That I knew. Most of us didn't know, and this I only saw when I saw this Mishnah Berurah. Sofei tevot. If you take the last letter of each of those words, well, if you want to try to spell it out, it'll be yeah. But if you actually take the gematria of it, ole mem, it actually is 40. Kineged arba'im yom mirosh chodesh Elul ad Yom Kippurim. It represents the 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul to Yom Kippur. Ki ba'elu arba'im yom hatshuva mikubelet liot libo karov el dodo b'tshuva. Because this is the time when we can now come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and achieve this level of tshuva. Okay, so that is the Sephardic minhag. The Sephardic minhag is to begin on Rosh Chodesh Elul because of the concept of, excuse me, of when Moshe went up to Har Sinai. What about the Ashkenazic minhag that many of us start on Motzei Shabbat? Where does that come from? So look at source number 5. Here the Mishnah Berurah again gives a couple of explanations. Source number 5, Miyom Aleph Shavua Shelifanav, says the Mishnah Berurah, Mishum Sheharbe Nohagim Lehit Anot Asara Yamim Im Yom Kippurim Uleolam Yachsiru Dalid Yamim Merosh Hashanah Ad Yom Kippur Shelo Yuchlu Lehit Anot Dahainu Bet Yamim Rosh Hashanah V'Shabbat Shuvah Ve'erev Yom Kippurim L'chein tzarech lahashlim dalid yomim kodem l'Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so this is an interesting explanation. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's a practical idea. Why 4 days? Because the truth is, says the Mishnah Berurah, according to this explanation, really it's only supposed to be from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. We're not supposed to have it earlier. However, and many people, by the way, he notes, have the minhag to fast during all of Aseret Yimei Tshuva. There are some people who have that minhag. It's an old ancient minhag. However, there are 4 days during Aseret Yimei Tshuva that even if you have the minhag to fast, you're not allowed to fast, which are 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, 1 day of Yom Kippur, we're all fasting, 1 day of Shabbat Shuvah, and Erev Yom Kippur, there's a mitzvah tea, you're not allowed to fast. Because of those 4 days that a person is not able to fast if he wanted to, so therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, we have to have those 4 days before Rosh Hashanah where we add tachanunim and we add those who want to fast can fast, and we also begin to say Selichot. Okay, a very practical answer, interesting. And then he says, well then why do we start always on Sunday? Why is it always Motzei Shabbat? So says the Mishnah Berurah, Ukidei sheyeh yom misuyam latchala tiknu yom rishon v'chol pam. In order to make it easy to remember. Otherwise, it can get very confusing whenever Rosh Hashanah falls. In order to just make it easy, we always know we start on Sunday. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah starts with a very practical answer. It's really just to make up for Aseret Yimei Tshuva, and in order to make it easier for us to keep track of things. But then he gives another suggestion. And he says the following. The od ta'am, we're in the third line, in the middle of the line. Od ta'am shekavu dalad yamim. Why 4 days? Shekain matzinu bikorbanot shetiunim bikur mimum dalid yamim kodem hakrava. There is a halacha that when a person is going to bring a korban to the Beit HaMikdash, he was supposed to check it over the course of 4 days. Okay, this may be familiar to us actually from the time the Korban Pesach, when a person had to separate it earlier on, and then on the 10th he would separate it, and then between the 10th and the 14th of Nisan was when the 14th was when he brought the korban. But you had to set it aside for 4 days in order to separate, in order to check it, to make sure that there is no blemish, because it is asur to bring a korban with a blemish to the Beit HaMikdash.
Does that mean you would have to set aside more than one in case there was a blemish?
It's an interesting question. You mean for a korban that had to be run on a specific time? That's an interesting question. I wonder. I don't know. Or it could just be that you set aside that, because then you could also say, which we say by in ladavar sof, meaning you have to separate. So I guess I would suggest, I don't know, which would be that you separated one and you do the proper, and if you get stuck, then you have to do a quicker bedika if you have to bring it by a certain time. That's a good question. I don't know. And then uvechola korbanot parshat Pinchas ksiv hikravtem ola. You're supposed to bring them as an olah. Rosh Hashanah ketiv asitem olah. L'lamed sheberosh Hashanah yaaseh adam atzmo ki'ilu makriv et atzmo. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's a difference in the way that the Torah describes the korban olah that was brought on Rosh Hashanah and was brought generally, and that's to show, says the Mishnah Berurah, to show that really on Rosh Hashanah the korban isn't to bring the korban, it's to bring yourself. Is that on Rosh Hashanah, we're meant to be bringing ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a show of dedication. And therefore, just like a korban needs to get checked for 4 days before it is brought, we on Rosh Hashanah, as we bring ourselves, we come to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we want to renew our relationship with you. We want to develop our relationship with you. We want to have this time with you. We need to spend 4 days checking ourselves, doing a proper, what we would call a bidika, to make sure, to go through our midot, to go through who we are, in order to do a proper search. And that's why, says the Mishnah Berurah, the minhag is 4 days before. You need a minimum of 4. You can always do more. You want to spend more time developing yourself? You want to spend more time checking yourself? You certainly can. I'm sure if somebody wanted to spend more time checking the korban, they could, although I'm sure that it wouldn't be, you shouldn't go crazy. Okay? But at the same time, the idea being we have to have at least 4 days where we are checking ourselves before we bring ourselves to Rosh Hashanah. So that is the opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. The reason why we have these 4 days is why we always start at least 4 days before Rosh Hashanah is either because to make up for the 4 days during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah when a person is not allowed to fast, or because we are similar to a korban who's coming in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and in order to show that we are doing that, we need to have 4 days where we check ourselves. We begin with Selichot. But there is another explanation that is given. It's by some of the Mefarshim that I'd like to explore with you. And this begins in source number 7 with a fascinating and very important question that the Ran, one of the Rishonim, asks regarding Rosh Hashanah. Okay, this is source number 7. A little bit of a long one. We're going to see it. We'll go through it together. But he asks a very important question and gives 2 very important answers, both of which he then uses to discuss the minhag of Selichot. The question the Ran begins with is why Rosh Hashanah? Why Aleph Tishrei? Right? We have a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that on Rosh Hashanah, everybody, on Aleph Tishrei, all men are judged. All men and women are judged. Says the Ran, why then? Of all the days of the year, why specifically does it make sense that Rosh Hashanah, Aleph Tishrei, that's the day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides to judge us? Why not a different day of the year? Where does this come from? And he goes on to explain how the other parts of when God judges for rain or when God judges the trees, he says we can justify the dates that are given. They seem to fit in with the overall theme of the seasons. Rosh Hashanah, why? Where does it come from? Why Aleph Tishrei? That's the question the Ran asks in source number 7. V'yesh lish'ol, lama adam nadun b'Rosh Hashanah yoter mi b'shar yamim? Why are men judged on Rosh Hashanah more than other days of the year? Debish lama means it makes sense. Sha'ar hadvarim dahainu tvuah. Uperiro ta'ilan umayim kol echad bismanonidon. He says it makes sense the other sins when it comes to grain, when it comes to payro, to fruit, when it comes to water. The seasons fit in with when HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges us. Gemara de Pesach zman tvuah v'atzeres zman peirot ha'ilan v'chag zman gishmei bracha. They all fit in with their seasons. That's the time that's appropriate for them. Aval Adam lama hu nidon b'Rosh Hashanah yoter mi b'shar hayamim. But why is it that Rosh Hashanah for man? What's the relevance? What's the connection? Answers the Ran a beautiful answer. We're on the 3rd line, about 5 words in, right after the question mark. V'teirutz hadavar. He quotes a midrash, b'shem Rabbi Eliezer, b'pasuk dirshu Hashem be'imatzo, ditanya. We have this pasuk dirshu Hashem be'imatzo ditanya. We learn in a brayta, be'esrim v'chamisha be'elul nivra ha'olam. We have a medrash that tells us that when was the world created? The world was created on the 25th of Elul, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, now, just to go back, there's the famous machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. When was the world created? Was the world created in the month of Tishrei, or was the world created in the month of Nisan? Says the Ran, the answer is it wasn't created on either of them. We have to re-understand this machlokes. Because the truth is, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the world wasn't created on the 1st of Tishrei. It was actually created on the 25th of Elul. Wait a second. If it was created on the 25th of Elul, so why does the Mishnah say that according to Rabbi Eliezer it was created on the 1st of Tishrei? Exactly. So continues the Ran here. Ulefize haditanya b'gemara de Rabbi Eliezer omer b'Tishrei nivra olam al gemar briato ka'amrinan de adam harishon shebo nigmar ha'olam nivra b'yom shishi. When we have this Mishnah where Rabbi Eliezer claims the 1st of Tishrei, what it meant was not that the world was created on the 1st of Tishrei, the purpose of the world was created on the 1st of Tishrei. Who and what is the purpose of the world? Mankind. And so according to this understanding, according to these midrashim, the world was created on the 25th of Tishrei, at least within the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The world was created on the 25th of Tishrei. Man was created on the 25th of Elul, 25th of Elul, and man was created on day 6, which is the 1st of Tishrei. Now, says the Ran, now we can understand why God judges us on the 1st of Tishrei. And he quotes a medrash, we're not going to see it inside, where he basically, the medrash says that man was created on the 1st of Tishrei and was judged on that day. Adam HaRishon was judged, where God basically said, I want to see how you're going to do. And following that initial judgment of Adam HaRishon on the first Aleph Tishrei, every single year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu now looks at man and says, this is the anniversary of your creation. This is the anniversary of when you were created. And therefore, God judges us, judges mankind every single day, every single year. Yes?
How much chance did Adam HaRishon have to sin from when he was created until later?
Excellent. So you're saying, what does judgment actually mean on that day? That's a very good question. No, it's a very good question. Again, we don't know 100% what the Midrash means. Judgment in that sense might simply mean God was basically giving him his command. It's a Midrash which basically talks about how every single hour a different thing happened. So it's a funny Midrash, meaning it's hard to understand the literal point of the Midrash. I don't know if it means he was judged in terms of his past actions. It could be that what God was basically, when we say judge at that point, it was more like given his command, given his mission. But in commemoration of that, God then judges us every single year. But it's a good question.
Another question.
Please.
There's a pasuk earlier in about the fourth line. Yoshu Hashem b'mitzvot. It's like we're searching for Hashem, but we're talking about the way Hashem is looking for us. It's the other way around.
Excellent. Well, one of the things we talked a little bit about this last week, specifically when it comes to Elul, is that that's the beauty of what this month is about. Meaning, when are we supposed to search for Hashem? When He's closest to us. There's a synergy going on here. Meaning, very often the most powerful types of reconciliations and relationships can be recreated, reconciled, is when both parties are looking for that. And so we discussed last week the concept of Melech Basadeh, God's in the field. So He's closer to us than He has been before. And then this is the most opportune time for us to then search Him out. As opposed to when He's sitting on His throne, that's also an important time, but it's a lot harder. And therefore, it's the pasuk of Yeshua Hashem b'matzah, as I understand it, is meant to be, this is your opportunity. This is when it's easiest to be able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore take advantage of that opportunity. Look for Hashem when He can be found, as opposed to when He can't be found. But that doesn't mean you can't search Him when it's harder. It's easier now, and that's why the pasuk is encouraging us. It's kind of what we talked about, how we say Hashem says to us, Hashivenu Hashem elecha, we say to Hashem, Hashivenu Hashem elecha v'nashuva. Bring us back, and then we'll come back. And Hashem says to us, Shuva elai v'ashuva aleichem. You come to me, and I'll come to you. There needs to be this mutual synergy of the two of them coming together and meeting as it were halfway. Okay. So what we see here, so says the Ran, this is why we're judged on the first of Tishrei. We're judged on the first of Tishrei because this is when man was created. And just like every year, I used to have a good friend of mine, and I don't know if he still does this, who told me that every year he and his wife, and then they were newlyweds when they did this. I don't know if they still do it. Every year on their anniversary, they would sit down, and besides having time to go out, they would talk about their goals and their aspirations, and whether they were continuing to live both individually and together in what they had been trying to achieve, right? When you celebrate something, or when you celebrate the creation of something or the beginning of something, that's an opportune time to assess, where am I? How am I doing in that relationship, in that? So the same thing is here. HaKadosh Baruch Hu basically says, I am coming and judging you now. I created you on Rosh Hashanah, and every single year, I'm now sitting and looking at this creation and judging the creation, okay? But again, recognizing that now, according to this, the first of Tishrei is obviously the day when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man. But when did HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually create the world? The 25th of Elul. So look at the underlined part in source number 7. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, zeh siman libanecha, kishem she'amadeta lefanai b'din b'yom zeh, v'yatzata b'dimus, kach atidin banecha liot omdim lefanai b'din b'yom zeh, v'yotzin b'dimus. Okay, this is just repeating what we just said. Just like God judged Adam HaRishon the first day that he was created, He also said to them, I'm now going to continue to judge you every single year. V'chol zeh eimatai, when is this? B'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh. On the 7th day, on the 7th month, the first day. Umikan smach lama adam nadun b'rosh Hashanah yoter b'shir hayamim. That's why it makes sense that Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment. Continuing the next underlined part. Ulekach nahagu Barcelona, says the Ran. The minhag in Barcelona v'glilo teha lahashkim b'ashmurot haboker b'chafei Elul. And that's where the minhag now came, that we don't just look at Aleph Tishrei as an important date. There's another important date, the day that God created the world. And the minhag became the 25th of Elul. And that is a minhag that some places had to start saying Selichot 6 days before Rosh Hashanah, not 4 days before Rosh Hashanah, 6 days before Rosh Hashanah, to commemorate the fact that God created the world on Kaf Hei Elul. The Ran then continues and says, this is all nice and good, but this only fits in according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. We generally paskin like Rabbi Yoshua that the world was created in Nisan, not an Elul. So then according to that, why do you have to say Selichot earlier? And he actually points out, that's on the bottom here, that because of that, many Kehilot don't say Selichot before Aseres Yemei Tshuva. So the Ran gives a couple of different opinions here, but what the Ran has added for us is another suggestion to why do we start a few days before Rosh Hashanah. It's not just about having 4 days to check the Korban. It's not just to make up for Aseres Yemei Tshuva. It's to connect us more to this time, the 6 days of creation. God created the world on the 25th of Elul, and therefore we begin Selichot close to the date. The date doesn't work out perfectly. In Barcelona, they started it on the 25th, but that's part, again, to why we begin a few days before Rosh Hashanah and not just start the Selichot on Rosh Hashanah.
25 of Elul is the creation of the world.
Correct, according to this understanding.
What do you think would be like, 1/1 of, the first day would be, if we go by the Western calendar, it's the first month, January 1st.
Okay.
Changes like the change from December, and it's when you do 1/1 by the months.
Okay.
But here it's in the middle.
So what did we say? Meaning, I think what you're saying is, I think if I understand what you're asking, you're saying, well, why didn't God create on Rosh Hashanah basically, or why don't we celebrate? So what did we explain? Because the world was created on the 25th, but what's the most important creation? 25th of Elul.
But there was no world before the.
Correct. So what was? Yes. So when the world was let's take a step back. What the dates were when the world was actually created, I can't tell you. But when now in our calendar, if we had to pick on we're using our calendar to identify certain things. Correct. I don't have an answer to what the date was back then. Back then, what was it? Was it called Chafei Elul? I don't know what it was called. But we've identified Chafei Elul as the time when the world was created, because our calendar isn't based on the creation of the world. Our calendar is based on whatever's been established. Okay, and so right now we're just Chafei Elul was when the world was created. Aleph Tishrei is when Rosh Hashanah is, and that's why we have Rosh Hashanah. So so that's what we've explained why we have Selichot a few days before Rosh Hashanah. The other question that we have to that hasn't been addressed is, okay, that's nice, that explains a few days, but there's another aspect to it. It's not only a few days before; it's also always has to be on a Sunday / Motzei Shabbat. Where does that come from? So we saw the Mishnah Berurah wrote practical reason that's because it makes it easier for us to calculate. Okay, but you know what? In case you haven't noticed, there's a lot of things in Judaism that aren't necessarily meant to be totally user-friendly. If there's got to be something more than just like, oh, we wanted to organize this. Okay, there are a lot of things that we don't organize. L'chorah, there's something more happening. So the source number 7, I'll just quote very briefly the Machzor Vitri, which is a student of Rashi, one of the famous students of Rashi. He just mentions that there was a minhag, the very end of his statement, Mimotzei Shabbat lifnei Rosh Hashanah. The idea was somehow to connect, to have Motzei Shabbat go into this Selichot. It's not about Sunday per se, even though it ends up being Sunday. It's much more about Motzei Shabbat. Now, what could it be? I don't know. But what I've heard suggested is that what we're doing is we're trying to tap into the spirituality of Motzei Shabbat. Okay, many of us are familiar. Motzei Shabbat is a time where Shabbat has ended, and what we're trying to do through Havdalah, through Malav Malkut, through the time of Motzei Shabbat, is to take the holiness, take the meaningfulness that we've achieved on from Shabbat, and bring that into the week. It's a very opportune time to begin the process of checking ourselves before Rosh Hashanah, thinking about things before Rosh Hashanah. It's to take the Kedusha, take the spirituality of Shabbat, and channel that into the preparation for Rosh Hashanah. And so we have the idea of 4 days, we have the idea of Motzei Shabbat, and they all are different reasons, but the sum total is it's all about trying to set up a certain mindset and a certain mentality as we approach Rosh Hashanah. If you look at source number 8 in the art scroll Selichot, they connect both of these ideas in a beautiful way. Then I want to read this to you, and with this we'll end our first section trying to just explore the history of the Selichot. Says source number 8, according to this comment, it would seem that the purpose of Selichot is nothing less than to remind us within our hearts and minds that we must recreate the pristine state of the beginning of creation. Meaning, why is this idea? We all talked about how it's because we want to recreate the day of creation, the 25th of Elul. Why is it important to recreate? So we could talk about that that's the beginning of the world and we're recreating ourselves, but there's something more here that they point to which I think is very meaningful. When God created the world, it was clear that there was only one power in the universe and that everything from the mightiest galaxy to the tiniest gnat owed its existence to him alone. The song of the day of Sunday, which was sung in the temple by the Levites, which we recite in our Sunday morning prayers, is Hashem is the world and its fullness. Because, as the Talmud explains, on that day God created heaven and earth and manifested his sole sovereignty over the universe. When one recognizes that reality, there is no place for sin. Sin is caused by self-deception. As the Talmud puts it, no one sins unless a spirit of foolishness enters him. If someone recognized without a doubt that there is no power or master but the one God, that only he gives the breath of life and the strength to exist, and that no deed goes unrecorded and unrequited by him, it would be impossible for one to sin, unless one were struck by an attack of lunacy. Meaning, if we really understood that everything we do, we would never sin. So where does sin come from? We lose that awareness. We lose that sensitivity. We don't think about it. We're less aware of it. On the first day of creation, when God's omnipotence was indisputable, sin was inconceivable. And by beginning to recite Selichot on that day, the Jew attempts to readopt that primeval conviction. And then he continues a little bit later, connecting it to Motzei Shabbat. As the Torah and the sages stress, the Shabbat, the culmination of the 6 days of creation, bears witness that God is the creator. So the Shabbat, like the 25th of Elul, focuses our attention on the beginning of time and reinforces our responsibility. And it is hoped our resolve to do our share in making the world what it was intended to be. For the Jew is called upon to make the world a better place, and the primary way for him to begin is by making himself a better person. Judaism teaches that an individual being is a microcosm of the universe. One's primary duty is to perfect that universe, his personal one, before moving on to the change and to change the rest of society. The confluence of the Shabbos and the first day of creation shed light on what the Selichos are meant to and can accomplish. They are to create a new world, to provide a new resting place for God's presence, to prepare us for the day that we pray will bring the fulfillment of the prophecies for the coming of Messiah and the end of days. And so the author here, I forget, I apologize, I don't remember who it was. I'll try to make sure to add it next time. Points out beautifully how it's not just a connection of, God created the world and Motzei Shabbos. There's a deep idea here of what we're trying to accomplish. By beginning our Selichot on a Motzei Shabbat, tapping into the Kedusha and the knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's oneness from Shabbat. Also the 4 days, preparing ourselves like a korban, connected to the 25th of Elul, the day that God created the world. We're trying to remind ourselves of what this is all about, of what everything is all about, and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the creator, which is the main thing we're talking about on Rosh Hashanah. Hashem is the Melech, Hashem is the King. We'll talk about that next week, Be'ezrat Hashem. And the way we do that is by tapping into all the different themes that we've discussed, and that is why we as Ashkenazim begin the Selichot, on Motzei Shabbat, 4 days, or at least 4 days before Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so that was part one. What we're going to do today was to try to understand the history of this Selichot, where it comes from, and why we do it the way that we do it. Now, if we had more time, what I would have loved to do, and we're not going to do it now, but I encourage you to try to do this, is to help try to go through the structure of the Selichot. I find that, at least for myself, until I started to study this, Selichot are a little bit hard to connect to. On the one hand, we know that there are certain tefillot that we say often, Hashem, Hashem, Kal Rachum V'Chanun, and we're familiar. Many of us are familiar with those words. But the rest of it is hard to understand. There's piyutim that are hard to understand. When do we jump from? We say psukim, and then we say piyutim, and then we do this, and then we do that. And very often, especially if the Selichot are a little bit quick, so the tzibur is jumping from one thing to the next relatively quickly. And it's important to understand that there is a structure to the Selichot. That the Selichot are a combination of psukim from the Torah. The primary aspect of the Selichot is, of course, the Yud Gimel Midot Tarachim, which we're going to discuss in a little bit of detail now, because that's the most authentic tefillah that was created and written and commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Shemot. Aside from that, there's a number of psukim from all over Tehillim that are meant to encourage us to do tshuva. And of course, there's the piyutim, what are known as the Selichot. The Selichot were not from the Torah. They're not psukim. They were written over the course of Jewish history, capturing, similar to the keynote on Tisha B'Av, that are meant to capture our emotions and encourage and to put us in the right framework of of doing tshuva. And so the ability to gain something from the Selichot will only work if we really understand what we're saying. And so showing up to the Selichot and just opening up the book and expecting ourselves to fully connect to it without really understanding what we're saying is so I would definitely encourage those of us who can to get an English Selichot, if you can. Remember that certainly during the part where they're reading the piyutim or they're reading the Selichot, if you don't understand what you're saying, you can even read it in English or read it a little bit slower. Okay, because the goal of these piyutim is to create a certain emotion, is to evoke a certain sense of tshuva. And if we're just reading it without understanding what we're saying, then it makes it harder to do so. And so I would have loved to have time to just go through and say and really explain what we're doing. We don't have time for that. I want to highlight one or two of the main parts of the slichot that I think are important. Of course, the most authentic part of the slichot, which many of us are familiar with, is what's known as the 13 attributes of mercy, the Yud Gimel Midot Rachamim, Hashem Kel Rachum V'Chanun Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet, and these are the words. Now, where do these words come from? So, if you look at source number 9, we see where this comes from. These words are from the Torah themselves, and in fact, these are the only words, the only tefillah that is actually authored and commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Okay, getting back to setting the tone, we talked about Chet HaEgel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe davens that Hashem should forgive OUisrael. And then Moshe does something very, very interesting. Almost, I would say, challenging. Moshe then says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, we're not going to do the whole conversation back and forth, but Moshe realizes that he's beginning to achieve a certain level of atonement for the nation. And Moshe gets a little chutzpahdik. Moshe says to God, Hareini nas derachecha. Show me your ways. He realizes he's making inroads, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is listening to him. And then he starts to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I want to understand this. I want to understand your ways. I want to understand how you work. I want to understand how the world works. Tell me more. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds by basically saying, no one can really understand my ways and live. No human being can ever fully understand my ways. And we have this whole idea where God, as it were, places Moshe at the cleft of the rock, and God passes by. And Moshe can see only the back, but he can't see the front. Again, I'm summarizing just for time. But if you look here in source number 9, we have the moment of the greatest source of revelation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does give in response to Moshe's request. The Torah says in source number 9, when pasuk Hey, the second pasuk, we'll do that for now. Vayered Hashem be'anan, God comes down in a cloud. Vayit yatsev imo sham, he stands with him there. Vayikra b'shem Adonai, and he calls out in the name of Hashem. Vayavor Hashem al panav, Hashem passes by in front of him. Vayikra Hashem kel rachum v'chanun erech apayim v'rav chesed v'yamet notzer chesed la'alafim notzei avon v'feshev v'chata'a v'nakeh lo yinakeh poked avon avot al banim v'al bnei banim al shideshim v'al rubeim. We're not going to go through every single word here, but these are 13 attributes of mercy that are meant to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, just to understand this, okay, there's a fascinating and beautiful Gemara that, again, I can't say we fully understand, but yet does give an amazing imagery to these psukim. Skip now, please, to source number. Oh, I see that the numbers are off, and I apologize. Source number 12. Source number 12 is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says the following: Vayavor Hashem al panav vayikra, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ilmale mikra katuv I efshar leomro. Had the pasuk not said it, we would not have been able to say it ourselves. Milamed shenit atef hakadosh baruch hu kishliach tzibor. God wrapped himself, seemingly in a talis, like a chazan. Veher'a lo Moshe seder tefillah, and he showed Moshe this tefillah. Amar lo, he said to Moshe, Kol zman sheyisrael chotin, whenever Am Yisrael sin, ya'asu lefanai keseder hazeh, they should do like these words, v'ani mochel lahem, and I will forgive them. Okay, again, remember, we're talking about a part of the Chumash that is very hard to really understand in this Gemara as well. But what's clear from this Gemara and from the Psukim is that this most authentic tefillah is a unique power. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe here that if Am Yisrael say these words, or we'll see soon, it's actually not really just to say these words, but the simple understanding is that whenever we say these words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises not to leave us empty-handed. And so they have become the key to our tshuva process. Another way of saying it is almost as if Moshe had said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem, I want to see your ways. Show me how I can understand you. And it's almost as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu basically said, the best way to understand me, the best way to connect to me is through the process of tefillah. Is through this process of tefillah. And because again, it's what's fascinating here is Hashem didn't just teach him the 13 midot. What does the pasuk say? He showed him. Or the Gemara says that he showed him. What does it mean he showed him? It's almost as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself was praying kiviyachol. What does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was praying? We don't really understand what that means. Okay? But what it seems to be is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically saying, if you want to understand how to develop a relationship with me and understand me in the greatest way, the way to do that is through tefillah, is through these 13 midot of rachamim. And therefore, we have to remember that these tefillot, these Yud Gimel midot, are a unique power. And the reason why they are the main part of the slichot, that everything revolves, and no matter what you're up to in the slichot, if you fall behind and the tzibor gets to the 13 midot sharachamim, you should stop what you're doing and say it with them, because of the unique power of what these slichot can accomplish according to our tradition. And by the way, these slichot can only be said as well with a minyan. The rest of the slichot can be said as an individual. You can say these slichot at any point in time on your own in order to help get you into the... These 13 midot sharachamim have a unique power, and they can only be said together with a minyan because of who they are and because of what they can accomplish. But there's another, the Sfardim blow shofar as well, correct. But there's another aspect to this that I wanted to highlight, because the truth is, we generally understood it to mean that if we say these things, Hashem will always answer us. But the truth is if you look carefully in the language of the Gemara, Hashem didn't say these words and I will always listen to you. What did Hashem say? Ya'asu lifanai kiseder hazeh. What does Ya'asu lifanai kiseder hazeh mean? Behave like these words. Do like these words. Act like these words. So what some Mefarshim point out is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us is not necessarily just to say these words. What are all these words about? Hashem kel rachum. He's a compassionate, v'chanun erech apayim. He's slow to anger, v'rav chesed. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu is asking of us is not just to say these words, but to act like them. To imitate HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you look at the next source number 13, Abba Shahul Omer, what is the pasuk when it says ve'anvehu? Zekeli ve'anvehu. It says havei domer lo. We are meant to imitate HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ma'hu chanun v'rachum, af ata hayei rachum v'chanun. Our job during the days of Selichot is not simply to daven. Davening is the one way that we see here that HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we can connect Him in a very unique way. But it's not just about that. What is it also about? How we act. These other days, the beginning of Selichot, what we're learning now from these Yud Gimel Midot Rachmim is not that we're just supposed to say these magical words and all of a sudden God gives us what we want. When I was younger, I used to think, oh, I could ask for like a candy, and if I say it during Hashem Kal Rachum V'Chanun, Hashem will give me whatever I want. No, it's much deeper than that. We're supposed to say these words, and we're supposed to grow in our davening, and we're supposed to continue to connect through tefillah. But it's much deeper. We're also supposed to emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu in accomplishing these midot. These Yud Gimel Midot Shirachim, we are meant to act. We're meant to be calmer people. We're meant to be more compassionate people. We're meant to be people who don't get angry as easily. We're meant to be people who don't hold a grudge. All of the midot that we're asking of HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you act in that way, then I promise you won't go empty-handed. One final thought that I want to mention, because this was just one of the tefillot that actually has its source in the Torah. But there's another tefillah that we say as part of this slicha. We say it less. We don't say it as often. We say it usually only one time. It also has its hint in the Torah, and that is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, Vayomer Hashem, Salachti Kidvarecha. Now, where does that come from? I want to share with you a beautiful idea that I heard from my father that I think very much connects to this time of year. What is that Vayomer Hashem? Where do we see those words, Vayomer Hashem, Salachti Kidvarecha? After which chet? After which sin? If this one was chet ha'egel, the other one is Chet HaMeraglim, the other big sin. Okay? After Chet HaMeraglim, Hashem says, I'm going to destroy the world. Moshe, I'm going to save you. I'll start a new nation with you. And Moshe turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, how could you do that? How could you destroy? If you kill the people now, what's everyone else going to say? They're all going to say, oh, Hashem couldn't beat out the nations of Canaan, and even though He took them out of Egypt, He couldn't beat the ones who were in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore He destroyed the nation in the desert because He couldn't take them into Eretz Yisrael. And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu turns to Moshe and says, okay, Moshe, salachti kidvarecha, I have forgiven them as you suggested, but this generation isn't going to get to go into Eretz Yisrael. Now wait a second. If I was Moshe, and God says, oh yeah, I'm going to forgive them like you told me to, but this nation isn't going to go in, I would have turned to God and been like, God, thank you for your forgiveness, but go forgive somebody else. That's not the forgiveness I was looking for. The forgiveness I was looking for wasn't that this generation is going to die out in the desert. I wanted you to forgive them. However, the suggestion that my father pointed out is, what does it mean, salachti kidvarecha? Kidvarecha is unnecessary. What is salachti kidvarecha? Of course Moshe was asking for forgiveness. But think about it. My father said, look at what was the argument that Moshe made to God? Moshe could have made the argument to God, this generation deserves to go into Eretz Yisrael. They're a good people. That wasn't the argument that Moshe made. What argument did Moshe make to God? What's everyone else going to think? What's everyone else going to think? If you destroy the people, then Hashem, everyone else is going to think that you couldn't do it. And therefore God says, okay, if that's the only argument you have, I will forgive them fundamentally, but you didn't defend these people. You didn't defend this generation. If this generation dies out and I bring the next generation, that's going to solve the same issue. It's almost as if God turns to Moshe and says, Moshe, I'm going to forgive, but don't forget that sometimes my forgiveness, the level of my forgiveness, the nature of my forgiveness might depend on what you ask for and the arguments that you make. If your argument only was, what's everyone else going to think? Okay, so then I could still kill out this generation and bring in the next generation. Had you argued, this generation deserves to go in. Had you argued something more, then maybe I would have forgiven differently. And I think the message for us is very, very important. When we're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for slicha, and we're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for forgiveness, remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu might turn to us and say, Salachti kidvarecha. Depending on what you're asking for, depending on your approach, depending on the things that you're coming and approaching HaKadosh Baruch Hu with, his response, his slicha, may be very much connected to that. And we need to be mindful about the arguments and the things that we're turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and saying, and what we're asking for. We talked a little bit about this last week as well. What are we asking for? Why are we asking for those things? And remembering that part of that is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will turn to us and say, Salachti kidvarecha. The slicha, the nature of that forgiveness may very much depend on the arguments that you give and what you're asking for and how you ask for it. And so those are just some themes to think about as we approach the Selichot season, Be'ezrat Hashem on Motzei Shabbat. Next week, hopefully, Be'ezrat Hashem, I believe there's supposed to be class. We'll talk a little bit about the themes of Rosh Hashanah and try to get some more meaning out of the Tefillot for Rosh Hashanah. Have a great week, everybody.